My name is Corliss Bean. You've received probably a handful of emails from me over the past couple of weeks. I'm also here with Sydney Shapiro, and he, as I said, is the voice of Module 3. He's also an Excel whiz. He's also leading one of our Knowledge to Action Exchange workshops that's going to be held at York University at our big upcoming event at the end of October. So if you're interested, please don't hesitate, and you're in the Toronto area or are traveling in for that, please feel free to register and we can provide you a little bit more information about that as well at the end. So just to give you a little bit of an outline of what we'll chat about, first we'll review what's been covered in Module 2, and I know Module 3 technically just started today, but we'll go over what sort of content is covered in that module. We'll bring in some common data analysis questions that Sydney, after working with many clients, has received. So he'll walk through some of those questions. And then additionally, we'll have an open discussion. And we'd encourage that open discussion to occur continuously throughout this. So I have a few spots within our webinar that we can actually have conversations and discussions about that. So to review Module 2, which is all about organizing your data. And this coincides quite well with Assignment 1, which is about creating that data inventory. We really focus on answering 3 questions about a data inventory. So not only what is it, but also what the importance of conducting a data inventory is, and how a data inventory can support you within your program evaluation. So when we talk about that data inventory, it's kind of condensing everything into one key location. So particularly, we want a record of all those existing sources that you have into one place, so that you can understand what all that evaluation data that you are collecting, is there overlap, is there too little, too much. It gives you a really good sense of that overall picture of your program evaluation and keeping that in one space. And it really helps to also save you time from one year to the next, because you have very clearly documented documentation of what data you are collecting, what works, what doesn't. And I think that's something to continuously reflect on from one year to the next as you are conducting your program evaluation. And then we also talked about ethical considerations around privacy and security. So particularly learning how to remove all identifying information from your actual data collection. So creating IDs and removing all of participants' names, making sure that the data is stored in a proper way so that it is maintaining those notions of confidentiality and anonymity. And then next we had in Module 2, Lesson B, we talked about actually creating that data inventory. So specifically, we worked through how to create a spreadsheet for data management, to set up specific forms and functions in Excel, particularly for kind of standardizing it so that we're making sure that we're using common language, standardizing our forms, and then actually being able to create that form to track our data. So we talked about the benefit of spreadsheets around the fact that they are accessible, user-friendly, and they can really provide real-time information if we use them consistently. And from those discussion boards, it seems like a lot of people are using Excel already to manage their data and store their data, which is really great. But the next piece on that and building off that is analyzing our data. So again, we'll cover that. It's covered quite a bit in Module 3, and we'll really focus this discussion today on that piece. So recognizing the value of always going back to your evaluation questions and making sure that we don't get caught up in all of the data. You might have tons and tons of data collected from all different sources, going back and identifying what our evaluation questions are, and what data is going to best help us answer those questions. Okay, and then Module 3, again, just started today. So the rest of the content for both Module 3 and Module 4 are live on the learning platform. So if you feel like getting ahead and not following our recommended guidelines, and you want to start tackling Module 4 sometime this week, you are more than welcome to do so. So Module 3, Sydney walked us through 8 different formulas for analyzing spreadsheet programs. So he walked through a lot of really, really great formulas that hopefully he might even go over a few of those today, but we talked about some. We talked about sum if and why all of those things are useful. We talked about min and max. We talked about how to conduct or calculate averages, how to count certain things, and all of these had really tangible and practical examples of how you would actually use this if you wanted to find the oldest youth in your program, the youngest youth in your program, our average attendance rate for programming. So all these things are really helpful to for you to be able to quickly understand what's going on within your program. And then module 3B, so our second lesson there, is all around calculating descriptive statistics. So specifically, this allows us to look at producing actual tables, charts, using the pivot table function. And I think we'll have a lot of conversations around pivot tables today, because just seeing what was on the discussion board, there's a lot of questions around those pivot tables. So Sydney's gonna, really go into depth a little bit about those today. And then we also talked about calculating and interpreting central measures and measures of distance. So specifically related to that, we talked about overview of how those pivot tables actually work, how to actually create one. We talked about forecasting our data, so looking at attendance rates, looking at particular, like if we had program costs associated or membership fees, we can look at kind of all of those sorts of things. Really, really useful stuff, again, for your day-to-day implementation and assessment of program processes. So more the fidelity of, are you reaching your target population? Are you reaching your target number? And then if you're looking at more of that financial piece, looking at that piece as well. So from that so far, we obviously would like to dig in and ask you guys, do you have any questions at all for us in terms of what, based on what you've learned so far or based on any of the assignments? We welcome any questions that you guys have right now, and we'll take a few minutes to do that, and then Sydney will jump on and have a few questions as well. Okay, we have a question coming in about whether or not it's better, what program is actually better to use. Is it better to use Excel, or is it better to use Google Sheets? Sydney, maybe that's something that you can share if you have any insights as to which one is better.
Oh, that's a good question. I read a comment on Twitter yesterday that a professor said a student came in and asked me a question about Google Sheets, but they know they should have been using Excel. It's always a much better idea to use Excel. It's a lot more powerful, and it could do most things a lot better, and it has far more functionality because it's a program that sits on your computer, as opposed to something that runs over the web and has to be relatively small and light and can't do as complex calculations. That being said, there's certain reasons why it's better to use Google Sheets. Like, for example, if you are using a sheet that you want to share with a lot of people, then Google makes it really easy to do that with one click. With Microsoft, it's a little more difficult. Also, if you're doing things around currency exchange, so if you have different numbers or different units in different currencies, and you want to be able to convert those in real time, so every time you open your sheet, it will give you the latest price in the other currency. It will basically do a Google search and do that automatically. Now, it's difficult. It's possible to do that in Excel, but it's more difficult. It's more complicated. So for things like that, I would use Google Sheets. Otherwise, I would stick with Excel, because for your day-to-day operations, not only is it really easy to use Excel because it's usually already sitting on your computer, but it's incompatible with many other people's programs, right? So you're able to send it to people and they could use it quickly too. And you could build formulas in there that will analyze huge amounts of data very quickly. So I would say go with Excel.
Excellent, great. And from, if I remember correctly from our last webinar, I think most people were using Excel, and then some people I know were using a few other different programs. So that's great, good to hear. Okay, perfect. So what we'll do is we'll keep asking, if you guys still have questions, keep asking them. We're gonna share 5 questions that have come up quite a bit in Sydney's work and some of my work with working with either our YPS clients or youth program support clients here at YouthREX, but also through various other platforms and different experiences that we've had working with different clients. So we'll open that up now. And one of the questions that did come in particularly quite a bit, and even from participants here within this certificate, is creating a pivot table, but they're not really sure where to start with that. So I think, especially on the discussion board, there was a lot of questions about it almost being a little bit too confusing because it's overwhelming. There's too much data. So Sydney, maybe you can speak to any suggestions that you have about actually creating a pivot table and where to start with that.
That's an excellent question. Pivot tables can be very confusing. It could be very scary, especially because you don't know how to do it. So my recommendation is, first, take a pumpkin spice latte break. Always the best way to start. And next, it's fall after all. And next, all you do is you click on Insert Pivot Table. Now, let's go to the next slide for a second. And this is a picture of basically what it looks like. So when you're making a pivot table, well, yes, no? We go down one? Didn't change. I don't know what, there we go, that worked. All right, so basically this is what we're looking at. Now, your version of Excel might look a little bit different, right? But essentially, if you have data on a regular sheet that has headers at the top, so it will say like, name, age, participant, etc. You can just take that data, create a pivot table, and the pivot table will be the part that we see on the right, right? So in this example, you'll see it says date, customer, city, region, product, category, quantity, and total sales. And you could just take those things and drop them in to become rows or drop them in to become columns. That's the first step. Now, in the upper left-hand corner, you also see something that says filter, and that basically just gives you a drop-down box to let you select and sort the data. On the bottom right-hand corner, you have value, and if you drop something in there, it will, for example, count, average, sum, min, max, etc. We'll do a few automatically. Now, why would you use this program? Let's say you have 100,000 lines of participants, so 100,000 different participants, and you want to find out how many people are from Toronto. You could write a formula to say like count this column Toronto and see how many there are, but you'd have to write one of those for every single city. However, if you just drag and drop the categories, which are up on the right-hand corner, into the box down below, so for example, let's say I put city on rows, so it would start with city, and then they would have a number next to it, and I drop city again, same label, I drop that into value, it would tell me, here's all the cities you have, this is how many times they're mentioned, right next to each other. So it makes it really easy to sort through a huge amount of qualitative data when you're doing this, and it will give you a quantitative number, right? So if you have responses which are similar but not exact, so for example, you say, did you have fun today? And people write yes and yeah and yup. You can't actually count those things together in Excel because they're all different, even though they mean the same thing. But by throwing them to a pivot table, it will reduce the number of answers into just how many there are, and it will be really easy to sort through. And it's really useful once you get into it and you look at some of the more complicated ways that you can use it. You could sort, for example, postal codes. You could look at phone numbers. You could find out how many addresses do you have in the 416 area code compared to the 905 area code, right? And you'll be able to divide those two into two different groups without using formulas, just with a few clicks. In this case, if you look at the example, here they have the row label is the product. So you see the products in the red box on the side. The columns are the regions. So you see the regions showing up like East, Midwest, Southwest. And then all the numbers that are coming out are the sum of total sales, right? So it automatically took total sales, it added them together, it looks at those two different factors. And if we're looking at bacon chocolate in the East area, the number in between is the sum of total sales that matches both of those criteria, right? So when you have your data, I recommend, first of all, make sure that it's complete. So it has to have a label across the top labeling every column of what it is. So it has to say like, name, age, participant, whatever. If you're missing one of those, it's not going to know what that column is or how to treat it. Then you could have empty data below. Like, so you could have, you don't know somebody's name or you don't know their age, you don't know their phone number. That's okay. And we could even go through and count those things. So a classic example that we have in many of our sample data is you have a column that says allergy information, like does the kid have allergies? And right next to it, we have emergency contact information. Now, we could look at how many people told us they do have allergies and we don't have their contact information, which is a bad thing. If they have an allergic reaction, we need to call somebody. and vice versa, right? So we're able to count how many participants overall, like how many names do we have, how many emergency contacts do we have, how many allergy information do we have, and we can compare all those numbers very easily just by dropping them into a pivot table, right? So this is a very fast way to look at a large amount of data and to sort it really quickly, especially when you're adding multiple characteristics, multiple variables. You could also take one of these other labels and drop it below one of your main categories. So for example, under region, we could also put city, and that would automatically add a little plus. So if we click on the plus next to where it says East, it would open up and it would show us all the cities under East, right? And it would do that automatically and break down the numbers even further. Carlos, you're muted.
Sorry. Do you mind if I just open Excel and maybe, or can we share your screen so that people can actually see? There's a few comments coming in that people are not sure actually how to do that. So I'll change presenter to you, and if you're comfortable sharing your screen, then you can just show them physically on Excel how to actually do that.
Wow, I suddenly got so many more buttons. Okay, how do I share my screen? What do I do?
You're on. Yeah, you're good.
And
we can see your sandwich in the background. It's delicious.
It's a really good sandwich. So let's put this like this, and we'll zoom in a little bit. All right. So let's see if I have a sample file we can take a look at. Nope, I guess not. We'll have to make one up. Okay. So this happens sometimes.
Even just showing where to actually go, what formula.
Here's a good one. This is a good one. All right. Okay. So this is the example that I actually use in the presentation. Okay, so it's a bunch of sample data, and let's go through and we'll just format it by column width. So let's take a look at what we have. We have first name, last name, company name, address, city, province, postal code, phone number 1, phone number 2. So we don't need the company name, we'll get rid of that. But we do need to know, for example, what province are our participants in? And I don't know if you can see that really well. I'll zoom in a little bit. And you'll notice that right at the top, I have first name, last name, address, city, province across the top, right? So I'm able to show which column I'm in. Now, in order to grab all this, what I'm going to do is I'll just go anywhere in the table. I'll go to where it says Insert, and I'll click on Pivot Table. Before we do that, and we'll get into it, I'm going to show you recommended pivot tables. Recommended pivot tables, for the only one it can come up with says count of address by province. Not super useful for us, but I mean, maybe that could be okay, right? So it depends on what we need. Now, in this case, what we'll do is we're going to press Pivot Table, and it's going to guess that we want A1 to H501, right? So that's going to be A1 up here to H501, which is 501 rows down. In our case, that's actually what we want. It's always important to double check that to make sure that what you're going to put into the pivot table is what you want. And I'll press OK. It opens up our new box, and as soon as you see this blue window over here, the little blue box, you know that you're good, right? That means our pivot table is happening. So now we have all of our columns. So let's say, for example, we want to break down how many participants are in each province and in what city, right? So all we do is we take province and we'll drop province into rows. Then we'll take city and we'll put city right underneath province. Now you'll notice for Alberta, we have Big Valley, Calgary, Camrose, Edmonton, etc. I broke it down, right? Then we could go even one level further and break it down by postal code, right? You'll notice that Big Valley only has one postal code. Calgary has all these postal codes. Okay, but for now, we'll get rid of postal code. We'll just drag it up like this. And I'm going to close these guys over here just so we can get back to our top list. Okay, now, what I want to know is how many people in total are in all these places. Now, we know that if you look through our data, every single participant told us that they have city listed, right? So I'm going to go and I'm going to grab city again because I know that everybody has a city. And I'll drag city down into values. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to count how many times cities mentioned in that list. So for Alberta, there's 42. For Saskatchewan, there's 21. For PEI, there's 1. And if I open this up, it will tell me by city how many people there are. So I only have one person in Big Valley, but I have 19 Calgarys mentioned in Calgary, in Alberta, right? So this sorts it both by province and by city in this case. Okay, and we could keep on going further, right? So for example, we could take phone number, and we could put phone number. This one's a little more complicated. We'll take phone number, and we'll put phone number. Oh, come here. Phone number. Oh, I don't know what's going on there. There we go. Okay, so phone number. Now it's similar to what we had with postal code, meaning that right now you see Big Valley, and it has the one phone number listed for the one person there. Calgary has 19 phone numbers because in this case, each phone number is different. But we could also do things like we could filter them, and we could look through them to, for example, only give us the area code. And that would allow us to get a more detailed view of how many people are in each area code, something we currently don't have, right? So this is a very fast example. And if we want to have this breakdown, we want to keep this, but we also want to add the participants' names, for example. Oops, address. Let's get rid of that. There we go. So this will tell us who is listed in each place, like which participants are in each place. Right? So that could be helpful as well. So for example, in Red Deer, we have these two participants, right? So it really depends, but we're able to go through it very quickly and count. Now, also, what we could do is, let's close this up. Now, this data set happens to be complete, but let's say it wasn't, and this often happens. Like we have to figure out, is data missing? So right now, I could grab first name and put it under here as well. Now you'll notice that the numbers are the same. The grand total is 500. But let's say I put in first name, last name, and city, and I compared them this way. I could very quickly see that, oh, I only have 490 first names, I only have 490 last names, but I have 500 cities. That means that 10 participants didn't give me their first and last names, right? So that tells me where the piece is missing and allows me to go back into it, right? Let's just look at a couple other examples. So does anybody have any questions so far? I can't see the chat, Carlos, so you have to tell me.
I'm just giving a minute to see if anybody does have anything else coming in. I think we're good right now if you want to continue, and I'll jump in if there is one.
Okay, so now let's do a couple more things since we're here. Okay, so far we did province, city, and count of city. Okay, so we have province, city, so on. Now, instead of count of city, in this case, we could also grab province and drag it down here, and it would give us the same number. How many times is each province mentioned, right? We have a total of 500. Now, we could also click in here. We'll go under Analyze and click on where it says Pivot Chart. Now, Excel's going to think for a second, and we could get a number of charts that would show us how the numbers break down. You'll notice that some of them don't work, right? We're going to stick with the first one, which is called Stack Column. And we're going to get a chart like this. Now, what this chart shows us is it shows us by province how many participants are there. And we can click on the chart under Design, and we could grab some elements like, for example, data labels, something like that, that would tell us how many people are in each chart, and we can compare them. Now, we could also filter this by clicking on province, and let's say only Ontario, and press OK, and this would show us the data only for Ontario. Right now, all cities are connected, but let's say we wanted to compare Abbotsford and Ajax only. Okay, it would tell us there's 3 in total. Okay, so we're able to go through and sort through the data very quickly by building these charts. Now, what we could also do, and let's go back into here, what we could also do is we could add something called a slicer. Okay, so I'm going to click on where it says slicer, and it's going to say, what do we want to create slicers for? And I'm going to press first name, last name, and phone number. And I'll press OK. And it's going to give me these 3 boxes. So I'm going to just make these a little bit smaller. Maybe I'll zoom out a little. There we go. Okay. So where's our other one? All right. So now let's click on here, and we're going to go clear filters, and this will bring us back right to the beginning. Okay. So right now I have all provinces selected. Right now I'm looking at BC and Ontario. I want it for filter. I'm going to press select all. And for province, select all. We're back to where we started. I'm just going to move these around so I can still see them. All right, perfect. So this creates like a little phone directory type of idea. So let's say, for example, you have somebody's name, and we could even add to this. Let's go insert slicer, and we'll put in last name. Okay, and I'll just put last name, sorry about that, over there. There we go. So if I want to find out where somebody is by using these buttons, instead of having to sort through it with formulas, I can go very quickly and we'll add these two guys too. Perfect. Okay, so take a look at this. Each one of these has a different piece of data that I could sort through. So for example, let's say we want Ontario only. I press Ontario. You'll notice that this chart changes to 175 and this changes to 175. And then in this list, only the cities that are blue and instead of gray are now the ones that I can look at. So I'm going to press Barrie. Right away, you'll notice all these are grayed out. All these are grayed out. I only have 3 people in Barrie. I have 3 phone numbers, 3 first names, and 3 last names. But I want to know Tanya's information. So I just click on Tanya and I get Barrie, Ontario, phone number, Tanya, and this is her last name. Right? If I want to get out of all this, I just press the clear filters and I go back to the beginning. So this is the whole country again. Let's say, for example, I want to go the other way. So I want to go by a participant. I know their last name, and their last name is Dubray. This person right here. I click on them, and then they live in Aurelia, Ontario. This is their phone number. Now, their first name is Precious. This is their last name, right? So only with one click, I'm able to sort through and find that one piece. That's why pivot tables can be incredibly powerful, because I could look through the data like this, right, and get a breakdown by city, or I can very quickly go through this in order to find out, like drill down with the data. So for example, if I want to do the same thing with PEI, I just click on there. I only have one person in PEI, and that person's name is Francesca. I have to go back to the top over here. LeMay. They live in Charlottetown. This is their phone number, right? So you can see that if you have like 10,000 lines, in this case we have 500, normally what I'd be doing is scrolling through the list like this, trying to find where that person is. But if I have it in a pivot table, I just have to click a few things, potentially even just their phone number, and suddenly everything shows up, like where they live, what their phone number is, what their first name and last name is. Right? Now, I could add one of those slicers for any row, any column that's in the pivot table. So it gives me a list when I press Insert Slicer of all these different pieces. If you have data with time in it, you could also add Insert Timeline, and that would give you a slicer that you can move side to side, and you could look at, let's say, last quarter compared to this quarter, or last month compared to this month. But using one of these, it allows you to pick from any one particular piece. So I'll turn it back to you, folks.
Amazing. Thank you very much for sharing that. Okay. Perfect. So if anybody still has questions about pivot tables, I'm sure there's hundreds of questions out there, and there we go. Hopefully you can see my screen again. As you start going through your assignments for actually analyzing your data for assignment 2, if you have more questions, you can definitely shoot me an email or reach out to Sydney, who also has his contact information will be shared on the last slide of this PowerPoint. But we have a few more questions that we'll try and answer, and then we'll also open the floor to you guys again if you guys have any questions as well. So we had a question actually come in through email before we started this webinar last week, and they talked about the fact that their program's already running, but they didn't collect baseline data. So their question was, can we still evaluate our program participants if they've changed as a result of the program if they haven't collected that baseline? So Sydney, do you have any insight into that?
So this happens a lot, right? A lot of times you come into a program midway, the program's running for a short time or a very, very long time, and you might have to adjust what kind of data you collect. So the first thing I'd say before you say, well, we don't have baseline data, we can't measure everything, is see what kind of administrative data do you have? Like what have you already collected? And that's why the analysis that you're doing on what you already have is so important. Like for example, we went to a program that they didn't collect any program data, but every time somebody signed up, they had a piece of paper. And that piece of paper went into a filing cabinet. But once we analyzed all those pieces of paper and we put them into the computer, we realized, oh, there's actually a lot we could tell about when people came in, when people went out of the program. We can compare what's happening right now to what happened in the past. Now, there are other strategies for asking people. We could talk to people. We could ask them, how did you feel about the program? They could tell us their reflections. We could do a qualitative analysis. When we're doing a quantitative analysis, we have to count something, basically, some kind of number. And we could get a lot of that from administrative data. So think about what intake form you have or participant data or something like that, and we can compare that to what that is now. And maybe that would mean that we'd have a mixed method study where we combine the actual numbers that we had of people coming in and out, different demographic questions, for example, that we have, and we can look at the actual change part qualitatively and ask people in a focus group, a survey, or an interview, how did you feel the program benefited you? And that would give you data. First of all, it would help you look at retrospectively what happened in the past, and it would give you a point that would be your baseline of where to go from there in the future. So the next time you run the program, or for the next year, you get new information that you'll be able to compare the next cohort to the one that you've collected data on. You can't go back and ask every question in the past, but you can start somewhere and build that baseline now, which would give you a snapshot of what's happening right this second.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. And hopefully some people that resonates with a little bit, because even when we think about pre-post data, I know a lot of people get caught up in measuring change over time. And if your program's short or you don't have that many participants in your program, sometimes that can be challenging to try and assess that. So again, looking at a lot of different program processes or from one year to the next. There's a lot of different ways that you can be creative in still assessing change throughout a program. Okay, so another question that actually we've had quite a bit is understanding what kind of information that you actually should collect, considering what is measurable and what does it actually tell us. So we know that there's a lot of different tools out there for us to use, whether it's actually using questionnaires or various methods. So maybe Sydney, you can shed light on either some of the strengths and weaknesses of different types of information that you can collect. Obviously, we're talking about particularly quantitative data here, but recognizing and knowing that there is a lot of other qualitative ways and using interviews and stuff like that we still can collect data as well.
So it's important to realize that when we do qualitative data, there's still a quantitative component. Like, for example, how many interviews do we conduct, and so on, right? So, we have to keep that in mind. Now, we're starting a new program today, and we want to figure out what data do we have to collect for the future. The natural tendency is to say, let's collect everything. Let's go out and collect every single number possible. And the problem with that is that people get overloaded. They get survey burnout. They don't want to answer 100 questions every time. We ran a youth program, and we said to them, did you have a good time? Are you going to come back? Did you learn anything? And we just asked those 3 questions consistently and then compared in a longitudinal study those questions week by week after each other. Now, it could be more, it could be less. The most important thing is figuring out, what does it actually mean? Like, what are we trying to figure out when we collect this information? If there's no purpose and you're just collecting it for statistics' sake, it's probably not going to be useful in your final report. And when you go to your funders and you tell them this completely random number, they're not going to care, right? So you need to figure out, let's look backwards. What do our funders really want to know? Like, for example, things like demographic information. How many people came to our program? How often was it delivered? What was the satisfaction levels? These are things that are really important. And if we measure those quantitatively, if we're counting a number every time that happens, we could start to build enough numbers to support our narrative going forward, right? Now, the most important thing is, when we're looking at what does it tell us, like what does it actually mean? Why is it important? You have to have a very realistic view of what that is. So if you have a program, in this example we gave at a webinar, you have a program and you're counting, what time did you wake up? How many cups of coffee did you drink today? Did you drink orange juice? The funny thing is, this was in a seminar, I went around the room asking people, to engage them. And one person said, oh, I had 5 cups of coffee and it was like 9 a.m. Like, okay, I don't know about that. But the point is there a correlation between how many cups of coffee you drink in the morning and what time you wake up? There isn't, right? It just happens to be a coincidence. Or maybe there is, I don't know. But it might not be data that's really worth collecting because it doesn't actually mean anything. Like, it's really important to put together numbers that actually make sense. And that's a common sense thing. It's not statistics. You just want to make sure that one factor is at least related to another. You don't even have to say it's causing another factor. They just go together. They make sense. So for example, if I'm running a youth program and I have 100 participants, I should be able to count how many kids ate lunch, how many kids didn't eat lunch, right? And that way I have some number that's really important to my program that I can tell my funders, look, only 80% of the kids are bringing lunches. I need to increase funding to provide lunches to the other 20%. That makes sense. That's a number I can count every single day and compare. But if I'm saying, I don't know, did they eat a banana or not, and that has no bearing on my program, maybe that's not so important. Maybe they're eating apples and oranges instead. So you really have to figure out, is there a purpose of why you're collecting it? And I would always say when you're looking at collecting the information, what ways can you gather it? You don't necessarily have to gather that data quantitatively by asking somebody for that data. You don't have to do a survey every time you want data. It's quite possible that we already have the numbers. So for example, in the program, I know how many bananas I bought because I went to the store and bought them. At the end of the day, I could write down how many numbers are left. So I know how many were used in between, right? Stuff like that. So we have a lot of data that's naturally occurring in our work process in the flow of data anyways. Really, we need to think about how can we tap into that. Like, for example, people sign up to the program. How many sheets did we actually get today and track those numbers? In social media, we have people who are signing up to our Twitter or to our Facebook. If we just count how many people we have following us every day, we could look at, did our numbers increase? Why did they increase? And so on. But really, it's important to try to correlate, like, for example, our activities with how many followers we have. I assume the more high quality content we put out there, the more followers we're going to get. So we can measure that number day by day without actually asking anybody. We're just counting what that number is. So we want to always make sure that whatever our end goal is, usually funders' requirements, but it could be something else, actually is capturable by an easy to use number. Numbers that are very complicated to get, like if you have to interview somebody 20 minutes every day to get that number, they're not going to, after 2 or 3 days, they're not going to be interested in doing that. So you need to really balance those factors to make sure that it's possible to get. And again, it could be a huge amount of data you're collecting, but ultimately you want to make sure that it's possible to do that, not a burden on you or on them.
Perfect. Thank you, Sydney. Okay. Another question that we have is around what kind of questions we should actually use to collect our quantitative data. And I think this goes hand in hand with some of the examples that you were providing before, but I think maybe some of the examples here in terms of multiple choice, Likert scales, rankings, maybe this speaks a little bit more to those self-report questionnaires that we're having youth or program leaders or other stakeholders fill out. So Sydney, can you speak to certain, like, is there pros and cons of using different types? What are the benefits of each?
So there's two most important factors that you need to consider. The first is, do your participants actually understand the question? So if you give somebody a Likert scale and you say on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you like pizza? Is 1 the best? Is 5 the best? Are you using something that tells you 5 is the best, or is it the other way around? And often, like I see when I have students giving me sample surveys, sometimes it's backwards. And then all your data is flipped upside down. So you really have to know that your participants understand. You see many of these Likert scales for youth start with a frowny face and have a smiley face at the other end, and then in between have a couple other faces, which makes it really understandable what you're collecting. Now, as far as is it multiple choice, ranking, Likert scale, it depends, right? It really depends on what the goal is. I think that the form itself should be interesting and engaging enough that people actually fill it out, right? That it's easy to do, it makes sense, it's flexible. And I always like the option of including other at the bottom. So if I give you multiple choice, what was your favorite lunch? And I give you the 5 options. If I write other, you could potentially write in a new category, which does 2 things. It lets me include that in the next quantitative gathering. And it also lets me qualitatively interview people if I'm interested in it, saying, listen, 60% of people wrote in other, and they wrote Hawaiian pizza, that was their favorite pizza. Why is that? Like, is there a reason why this is your choice? And if so, maybe that should be on the survey too. So that's just an extra way to make sure that people aren't coming up with something that you're not familiar with, right? Maybe there's another choice. I would say the first most important thing, that your participants understand what they're doing. And the second most important thing is thinking for a second, what number comes out of this? Like ultimately, when you put all the numbers into a spreadsheet, what are you looking at? In a Likert scale, you're going to get a number like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 7. You pick a number, you put it in there. Now, with multiple choice, you may have a whole bunch of different choices. If you could say, check any box below of what you like, you could end up with 22 different checkboxes, which means it's going to make it far more complicated to analyze. Sometimes you need that approach, but there has to be some happy middle ground. Sometimes you say, tell us what you'd like, and they could write in anything. Then you build a pivot table to analyze your whole bunch of random responses quantitatively. So you're counting how many responses there are, but people could write many different things. You'd have to do a little bit of grouping to make sure that the answers that mean the same thing are all put together. And ranking, when you're asking people to rank one thing above another, you have to really figure out, how do I analyze this? Like, how do I actually take those pieces and show what the overall winner is? Again, you could do this kind of thing with a pivot table by assigning it like a scale or by putting it in a particular order. When you put that into a pivot table, you'll be able to count how many of each things came out and what's people's first choice compared to their second choice, right? So there are ways to do it. You just want to make sure that everybody, both you and the participants, understand what they're doing and that the approach makes sense to answer that specific question.
Excellent. Thank you. And this, yeah, I think a lot of what Sydney talks about is important. Not necessarily, yes, it does help with the analysis piece, but also it's something should be thought of when you're actually creating your tools before it actually gets delivered to the youth or whatever stakeholder you're engaging. Okay, last question, and we spoke about this very briefly, is just around how we can actually use both qualitative and quantitative data together in our analysis. So we know from the discussion board and just a lot of programs in general do a combination of both. Specifically, we know that this course only focuses on quantitative, but recognizing how we can combine these together to create a comprehensive picture of our program.
Okay, so there's a lot to talk about with this, but basically the idea is, are you picking one approach or the other first, or are you doing both at the same time, right? So let's look at a couple examples, and of course they're about pizza. First, we'll start with, you do qualitative first. I'm thinking about opening a pizza store. I don't know what toppings people like, but I know that there's probably some out there. People have different opinions. I'm going to go in and ask people. So I'm going to gather a large amount of qualitative information. I'm going to ask a whole bunch of different people, what toppings do you like? Based on that, I could develop a survey. Here's people's top 10 requests. Are you interested in one of these? And you check off a box. So that survey I'm going to gather at the end is going to provide me with quantitative data, which is far easier to scale up. Imagine this. You have to either interview 500 people, meaning you walk over to 500 people saying, excuse me, sir, what's your favorite pizza topping? Or you could just put an ad on Facebook, say, fill out our pizza survey. People love pizza, and they'll all fill it out. It's going to be a lot less work to do 1,000 pizza surveys than approaching 500 people in real life. So once we have an idea of what to ask, we can do that. Now, it can work the other way too. We do a survey first with the top 10 expected choices, like, for example, pepperoni and mushroom and whatever, and we put those on the list. But we also include an other. Now, when I get back my survey, I realize Hawaiian pizza with mushrooms is the #1 choice, which is bizarre because I didn't think people would like that. I don't know why I'm going to stock that in my store. To really get beyond the numbers, beyond the counting, I have to ask people to describe, I have to talk to them and find out why. So when I sit down in a focus group or an interview and I say, listen, a lot of people checked off this box. I don't understand, like, what is this coming from? Now, this is a very important step because you could find out a couple things. First of all, you could find out why people pick that. They might tell you a completely unexpected reason. Like, for example, they're in their childhood, they have great memories of this kind of thing, and that's why they like it, which you would never have found out using a survey. And the other one, which is very, very important, is you could find out if there's some other factor that's influencing it. Now, the reason why everybody told you Hawaiian pizza with mushrooms is that it happened to be the same weekend as Mushroom Festival, and everybody's eating mushrooms all the time, right? This is called the co-founding variable, some other reason that it's influencing it. And sometimes you pick this up and you don't really understand how the two things are related. So in a youth program, you say to participants, did you have a good time? Did you learn anything? Are you going to come back? But at the same time, they just got free popsicles and they're all sitting there eating popsicles. They're super happy. And of course, you get 10s across the board, right? Now, the next time, everybody might be miserable. So what they're actually rating isn't that session. What they're actually rating is the popsicles, right? So we want to make sure that we can distinguish between the two. And usually we do that by scaling up our sample. Now, in quantitative, we want to make sure our sample is as big as possible, right? That we use a power calculation to figure out what the big sample size is and how the people that we survey correlate to the big population. But when we're doing qualitative, we're not really interested in getting as many answers as we can get. We're looking at getting really in-depth, detailed answers, right? And those detailed answers can give us new directions that we could ask people in, that we could think about, that we could integrate into our program. So if we realize that something's not working, we can either count what's working and what's not, or we can ask people, what do you think we should do instead? And that piece really won't come out. So like I said before, it's always a good idea to put an other box, whether you're looking at gender and you have two choices and you say other, whether you're saying what pizza topping do you like and you put an other box. It just gives potential people the potential to answer qualitatively on a quantitative survey, allowing you to both count how many people said other and think about maybe other is something that selection that people used is something I should integrate into my quantitative survey for the next go around. And that way you could constantly be improving your tools to make sure that they're reflecting what your population is actually asking for.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Sydney. And keeping in mind that once we have actually analyzed our data, we can have a combination of both. So say, for example, we end up doing a graph or a chart or a table that reflects the quantitative data. We can also have one or two quotes from either interviews or other maybe arts-based methods that help reflect our findings that are presented within the table. So you can combine them together.
I just want to add one more thing. Sorry.
Yeah, of course.
You're right. So now I actually wrote that down and I forgot. When you produce a report for your stakeholders at the end, you're going to have like a page on it with a bunch of writing about the program, and you're going to tell the story of the program. And in the middle of the page, you're going to have a big graph that says something like 45 of participants X, right? Like that always happens. It's very important when you're doing that, when you're combining the qualitative and quantitative, that whenever it's a percentage, you always tell them how big the group is, like 45% of what, right? I went to a program recently and they had one person who said that they suffered war crime trauma, right? Now, they said in their report, 100% of people who selected work, but what does that mean? There was only one person. It wasn't the 1,000 people in their program. So you have to be really careful when you're using those numbers to explain how big the numbers are that you're gathering quantitatively and how big are the numbers you're gathering qualitatively so they work together. Otherwise, you might be telling a different story than the numbers that you're showing, right? But besides that, yeah, it's very important to have both of those factors when you're getting into your report.
Perfect. Excellent. On that note, we actually had a question that just came in about measuring change or growth in individual participants using more of those qualitative pieces. So Sydney, I don't know if you're familiar with our head, heart, feet, our qualitative arts-based tool that we have on our YouthREX measures inventory, but recognizing those types of pieces and how you can use Excel to actually code or analyze these sort of pieces quantitatively. Sydney, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I mean, and I think that once you gather data from those different pieces, you're able to put them into the sheet, look at how they change over time, and keep on tracking them. Like at the beginning, we talked about anonymizing data. It really depends on what your purpose is. If it's your own program and you're not sharing the data with somebody else, that's probably a bad idea if you're following people every single week, right? If you're sharing the data with somebody, it's very important to anonymize it. And you just want to make sure that as you're putting in the data, you could just set them up column by column. You're able to compare. In this case, you would be doing multiple comparisons over time to see how the participants change. You also want to make sure that those check-in periods, like the times that you're doing your cross-sectional check, it turns into a longitudinal analysis over time. You want to make sure that it makes sense to check in at those times. Like, am I really going to see a difference between this week and next week based on my intervention? And that question is where you go back to your logic model and you say, like, what are my short-term outcomes? What are my long-term outcomes? And how do those pieces fit together, right? So yeah, assuming that you can generate data which has numbers in it of something that you're counting, of scores that you're coming up with, you're able to keep on looking at those every period and matching them against each other. Ideally, these would be able to isolate whether the program is having the intended consequence, is having the effect that it wants, and that your intervention is reaching towards your long-term outcomes.
Excellent. And I can speak to that briefly as well. I'm actually working with a client right now, and they have a series of workshops that they have guest speakers come in throughout their entire program. So say they have 5 guest speakers come in within a 12-week period. At the end of every guest speaker, they do the head, heart, feet. activity, and they talk about specifically what did they learn within this program, how are they going to use that information and put that into practice. And I've worked with the client to actually document that, because they're doing it at multiple times throughout it, that they're documenting it and managing that data within an Excel file, and then to kind of quantitatively analyze it. Although it's open-ended, it's very inductive. You can still look and see if everybody, most of your participants are talking about, you know what, I increased my awareness around business management skills, or I increased my, like I learned something I didn't know, and there's consistency about that specific topic, or I learned about computer programming today. Or you can kind of still qualitatively analyze by looking for themes, and almost quantify that by, okay, 8 out of our 10 people actually talked about this specific thing, which is neat because it's completely open-ended, it's completely inductive, that they can write anything they want, but we're still seeing patterns and themes within that individual qualitative data that we can somewhat quantify to count, and say that 8 of our 10 participants, as a result of this workshop, like discussed feelings or beliefs in their skills related to a specific topic. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Okay, we only have a couple minutes left, so we actually, I think we kind of have opened the floor throughout, but if anybody has any specific questions, whether it's certificate related, assignment related, I know assignment 1 was due last week, and assignment 2 is coming up due this week. So if there's any questions related to that, any questions related to your specific program, or any best practices or things that you've kind of worked through or found worked really well for you, we'll leave it open for another minute or so just to see if anybody has any questions kind of coming through. And as we're doing that, I'll just speak to, yes, as a quick reminder, that your second assignment, where you're actually creating that spreadsheet and conducting some analyses, is the suggested deadline is October 19th, so the end of this week. So please submit that using Dropbox. And then we also will be offering another webinar similar to this next week with David, who is our Module 4 facilitator, and it's all going to be around data visualization and data storytelling. So a PDF of these slides are available to you in the handout section. I'll also send an email with the actual link, but if you click on Ask Us Anything, the blue underlined, that will take you to a direct link to register for the webinar if you'd like. And yeah, I'll just wait, or I'll advertise this as well. I'll just wait to see if any other questions do come in. And if not, I will wrap up by saying thank you very much to Sydney for joining us today. Thank you for your participation, your engagement from everybody else. And yeah, as a recommendation, we do have a really exciting event coming up. I've sent a few emails about it. We have our provincial exchange that's happening October 24th to the 26th. It's housed at York University, so if you're in and around the Toronto area and you can join us for 1 or multiple days, we have some great pre-conference workshops that Sydney and myself will be facilitating, one all around data analysis, data visualization and storytelling. And then we have a large, a full day on the 25th of tons of different things that are happening. So I encourage you to register. It's all free, which is fabulous. So please feel free to hop on our website and register for anything that you think is of interest to you. And it's a great opportunity for networking too. There's going to be a lot of different stakeholders there within from all across Ontario for sure. Perfect. Okay, so I don't think there's any other questions that have come in. So for that, I will wrap it off for today. And again, please join us next week at the same time for another webinar, Ask Us Anything. Please come, bring your questions. And thank you again to Sydney for joining us today. Thanks a lot, guys. Have a great day.